To clarify, everyone gave positive. Yes, everyone gave positive consent for recording. That's fantastic. Love it. We can begin. So debating on the motion. Hello, everyone. Debating on the motion. This house would proportionately subsidize, e.g., scholarship and funding university courses according to the employability of our graduates. We now call on the Prime Minister to start off this debate. Here. Good luck, everyone. Have fun.
Am I clearly audible?
Yes.
All right. So POIs verbally. I prefer to take one like really early, so like have one ready for me if you can. I'll start in a bit. All right, starting in 3, 2, and 1. Today's debate is very simple. It is about where the people's hard-earned tax revenue flows to. We believe that education that ought to be prioritized is education that helps the most vulnerable, uplifts lives that are previously suffering, and makes a difference. And for that reason, I'm very glad to propose. How is this policy going to work? So the way we're going to figure out what kind of jobs are like socially or that like employable is like very simple. We're going to look at like macroeconomic data, like the percent of graduates who immediately get employment, at how much money they earn, so on and so forth. We're also happy to look at like other sorts of metadata, like data on sites like LinkedIn, and see what kind of major get hired the most. And we're also going to do this like constantly to ensure that we are always on top of the job market and be able to flexibly adjust where we allocate our funding. I accept the trade-off that yes, the sorts of majors that get prioritized is things like computer science, like engineering, like applied mathematics, etc. Whereas the other majors we do devalue are things like communication, things like the liberal arts, or like, I don't know, like really, really abstract, like, theoretical physics, like string theory. We're happy to trade off those things, right? But I want to point out, number one, the trade-off isn't going to be extraordinarily high for a few reasons. The first thing to point out is that people who generally study these things are oftentimes very rich individuals, right? People who already have relative social privilege or some backing to fall back on. This is because people from like somewhat like lower middle class backgrounds have immense pressures on them to get a job once they graduate, because either they have family who pressures them, because they have to support your mother, or because you have a desire within yourself to like have a better life than you just had before, and you therefore you want to opt in the most safest and most risk-averse career. What this means then is that, number one, even these courses become more expensive and like their scholarships are available less, we're still able to ensure that the people who generally opt in are rich enough to be able to afford that anyway. But secondarily, this means then that the graduates of these courses who generally become alumni donors are going to have enough money to donate a lot of money, not a lot of sum anyway. So outside of government subsidization, which by the way is what the debate should be about, outside of government subsidization, we can still have private donors who are going to be rich because they're the background that then study things. Giving back money, right? But giving back money. But secondarily, that people have a hierarchy of needs anyway, right? Like we care far more about individuals with like financial security, for like who want financial security than, for example, individuals who want to study something abstract because they have a passion for it. But more on that later. The claim I'm going to make is simple. We think these sorts of highly employable majors and courses are extremely beneficial for social mobility. It impacts people in low socioeconomic classes who have always had a terrible life, or the middle class should be able to achieve a higher quality of life and give their children and future generations a better life, right? Why do we think that these sorts of majors are able to achieve that goal? The first thing to point out is that these majors, these sorts of jobs that the majors flow into, are always in really, really high demand, right? Computer scientists are demanded in every single field, from biology to business, so on and so forth. In contrast, things like theoretical physics are extraordinarily niche like subjects that maybe get hired in like few select universities for professors or maybe research assistants, but aren't really demanded in a diversity of fields all of the time. Secondarily, notice that the demand is also quite instant, right? Which means that immediately after getting an undergraduate degree, a CS major can immediately find a job in a high-stakes firm like Microsoft, whereas comparatively, we think like more abstract fields like liberal arts or like physics need you to have more specialization, right? What this means then is that you can instantly get a job after graduating and pay off your debt and support yourself and your family if you're a CS major. But if you're, for example, studying like theoretical physics or studying like the liberal arts, you need to take on more debt to have a graduate degree, to specialize even more and take on all those risks. The question then is, why is it in the status quo that these more lucrative, high earning, like high income degrees, like highly employable degrees, are quite inaccessible in the status quo. The framing is very, very important. While these degrees are quite demanded, the problem is that these courses are quite expensive and therefore very difficult for these people in the middle class and lower socioeconomic classes to afford for a couple of structural reasons. The first thing is just the fact that the demand is so high. Universities are able to place a very high premium on these courses and like jack the prices up by having tuition fees to be really, really high, making it quite unaffordable for the vast majority of the middle class and the lower classes. Secondarily, notice that these courses tend to have high like costs of running as well, POIs verbally, by the way, right? To maintain a computer lab, you have to have top-notch technology. I'll take that later. Top-notch technology in terms of like the sort of hardware you have. Like to be able to maintain an engineering lab, you have to have really good sensors and other sorts of like lab equipment that oftentimes literally require millions of dollars to, number one, afford, but secondarily maintain at the top-notch quality. What this means then is that oftentimes the tuition fees are driven very, very high. It means scholarship availabilities are low because the courses and the manager of the courses don't have enough funding to be able, don't have enough disposable funding to allocate to scholarships, making them inaccessible. Before I move on to the solution and the weighing, I'll take that point.
Yeah, so obviously scholarship committees and people who are funding universities aren't stupid. Right now, there's already a lot of funding going into things like CS and STEM because of the glorification of it. Your burden is to explain why the only metric we ought use is on employability. Surely a holistic consideration can lead to the same outcome.
15 seconds. Yeah, if I'm a very rich, like theoretical physics graduate and I donate $1 million, I will demand the scholarship community to donate that to the physics department and not to, for example, computer science. It's very intuitive, right? So like that is generally how university degrees work, university scholarships work. Why do we solve this? A couple of crucial structural reasons. The first thing to point out is that just trivially speaking, we have more money in our side of the house, right? But more importantly, because governments are quite rich and education is something people tend to value, especially in slightly more developed countries with like tend to care more about higher education, you're going to have a lot of money you're able to allocate specifically to highly demanded sorts of majors that have high employability rates, right? We have millions of dollars we can now allocate to hiring more professors so we can have more classrooms for more students. We're able to allocate money to have more scholarships for low income, for POC, for people of color students to allow them access to a field that allows them for the very first time to enter college, to be able to break generational poverty and give their future generations a better life. But secondarily, you have a crucial signaling mechanism. The status quo right now is one where college is seen as an elitist establishment, which doesn't benefit you if you're, for example, a people of color. You have your parents telling you that college is a waste of time. You're better off learning a trade. When the government explicitly funds these sorts of things and makes a clear message that we're going to give more money to degrees that give you more social mobility, it sends a signaling mechanism to these communities who might more likely to now invest behind their children's education. You have more Black and brown parents who never went to college having a college fund for their kids, allowing them to access these things. What is the weighing here? Yes, we're maybe trading off the liberal arts, but we think it's better for a couple of reasons. One, these things have more tangible benefits. More CS majors mean that society is better off, more businesses can sprout off, and more people have better mobility versus abstract benefits of theoretical physics that may manifest in 100 years, but not right now. But secondarily, states have the biggest obligation to the most vulnerable, we should protect in our side of the house. For all these reasons, I'm extraordinarily proud to propose.
All right, fantastic. Thank you very much, Prime Minister, for that speech. We'll now proceed with the clash from opposition by inviting the leader of op whenever you are ready. Go ahead.
Okay, am I audible and visible?
Yes.
Okay. Just to be clear, I take verbal PLIs. I won't be checking chat. Okay. Time starts now. The biggest problem with proposition's case is that they give us a set of reasons why certain things are good, but they do not explain why their policy uniquely solves all these better innovation, better donations on their side of the house. I want to talk about 3 arguments in this debate. Firstly, why you oversaturate employment in certain sectors. Secondly, why you massively reduce choice for individuals. And thirdly, why you make university worse on proposition side. But before that, one main piece of framing to set up this debate. What exactly does this employability metric look like? I think obviously it's based on numbers. It's based like how many people from your little LinkedIn profile gets into certain sectors. This is important because people are still employed even if they go to less popular majors. So if you're art major, for example, you're still going to come out and be able to get a job. It is not true that art majors are intrinsically like not as useful, or that it is not true that all of your benefits will manifest well into the future, you're still able to get a job. But second, insofar as universities are able to push their students into internships as soon as they graduate, as soon as possible, and deprive them of the ability to actually explore their interests because they want to increase their employability number and in turn get all of these better benefits, we think that universities have an incentive to just increase their employability number by immediately pushing their students towards these sectors. With that, first argument then on why you oversaturate employment in certain sectors. If proposition is correct, that more funding means that these sectors become even more prestigious and that more people, they're able to get more people within these jobs, then obviously there's a limited amount of jobs in the status quo. You cannot somehow generate more jobs just because you have more people within these sectors. If more people go into finance, for example, because of these scholarships, you then oversaturate the job markets simply because there's very limited job. I think even if there's a high demand in sectors like computer science, for example, we see no shortage in computer science majors right now. The very fact that you're incentivizing 2,000 more students to go there are only going to ensure that minorities who actually need these jobs get pushed out. You not actually create extra job. This harms the very minorities that they want to talk about, because when you require connections and many of these individuals within these sectors are already extremely rich to begin with, like they also conceded on how most people in the finance sector are extremely rich. This means that it's less likely for minorities to succeed in things like finance because you massively increase competition under our side. Because the proposition correctly points out, people who succeed in status quo are already rich, minorities are still harmed under their side because it is the same rich people who goes on to succeed instead of the minorities that they care about. The difference under our side then is that the few minorities who are able to stay within these programs, absent these scholarship programs, do not have to compete with the extra 2,000 people that you now incentivize to go into these jobs. Second argument then on why you massively reduce choice for individuals. The thesis of this argument is that when you eliminate certain classes that is not deemed as employable by your metric, you reduce agency for individuals to choose the courses that they actually care about. Before that, Shayor point.
If any field becomes saturated, then the graduates will get less employment. So we can quickly adjust the model and allocate less funding to that. Our model is flexible for saturation. The argument makes no sense.
The difference is that you already told these minorities to go into these sectors. So now they're coming out of these sectors with no jobs. I don't understand why you're saving minorities on your side, if that is the case. I'm going to go to my second argument then on why you massively reduce choice for individuals. Note that there's still sectors like agriculture sciences or application for neuropsychology that people are still interested in, even if it isn't necessarily their major. This is important because when you have these scholarship programs, you decrease decreased investments within these sectors, you have less money and support for people who do choose to do this. This is important because universities are inherently profit-driven, which means that certain courses are incompatible with profit. Certain courses that do not get the scholarships that they talked about are likely to be pushed out. They're less likely to invest in things like professors or courses to actually incentivize these students to go. Note that there's already funding for things like computer science and finance. There's successful computer science alumni in the status quo. That's why schools still have fancy computer labs absent of this policy. That's why you do not lack donations under our side of the house, because there's still people who come back and is still rich. But secondly, you decrease willingness for individuals to apply for these courses to begin with, because the majority of these people are on loans who depend on loans and scholarships to go to college, just do not apply to these other courses to begin with. Do not apply to agriculture, for example, even if they're truly interested in, which is why the school will preemptively get rid of these courses because of the low employability, because they don't want students to go join these courses to begin with, so not enough students go. This is bad for two reasons. Firstly, you significantly reduce the agency for individuals to actually pursue what they want, because even if the degree is less employable and less desirable in the long term, people can still get employed from it. But secondly, this policy creates a disincentive for people to join to begin with, so they don't actually get a meaningful choice to choose whether or which major they actually want to pursue. The comparative then is that under our side, universities are more likely to moderate. You have an organic incentive to actually look at demands and give equal scholarship, for example, to people who do choose to choose these courses, and that people are not pushed out of the choice simply because of this employability metric. But secondly, the difference is that under their side, they force this change to happen instead of letting it organically occur. This is why you oversaturate job market and have all these harms that we talked about. But the second harm there is that you stifle innovation, because there's still meaningful aspect of different sectors and different majors to begin with. This looks like creativity and like critical thinking that comes from art that you need to learn by being an art major or taking a few art courses within your universities. That's why certain universities ensure that you do have art credits, for example, and that all of these benefits can be applied to other jobs. The difference here is that when you're able to integrate different ideas from actively pursuing other majors that are not that are probably not the most profitable. So for example, if you take art courses at politics majors, for example, you can still learn a large amount of knowledge from it. But the difference that under their set then is you significantly decrease the ability for them to access these courses because art courses are just deemed as less significant because they don't have a high employability rate under their side of the house. This is important because the diversity of skill is actually what is needed to be developed within university. You do not want people to become robots who only know how to do computer science, for example. You also want them to do things like learn critical thinking that they can get from other courses as well. I want to go into my third argument then on why you make university worse under their side of the house. Because even if this scholarship is proportional, they still give incentives for universities to artificially increase employability on their side. Because universities inherently have a conflict of interest with you exploring your interests after you graduate while also forcing you into low-level internships because they want to make colleges make their employability numbers go up. This is bad because firstly, you have an incentive to place students into entry-level jobs to be employable and get more funding. This distracts universities from doing things like focusing on teaching or ensuring that students are actually learning diverse skills because you want them to immediately get a job. Second, the change here is that they become focused on the end outcome. So for example, they focus on writing CVs and classes instead of actually teaching meaningful skills that can be applied in the future. So proposition essentially forces all students to learn these things prematurely because colleges want to push them into jobs. But secondly, there's a monetary trade-off here because if you're forced to invest in career investment, host a bunch of career fairs so that people can get these internships, you trade off with good professors and good resources, for example, internally within this major. This is why it's on net just worse for university as a whole because you create an artificial incentive for university to be less cautious with what they're actually teaching their students. Proud to oppose.
All right, fantastic. Thank you very much, Leader Up, for that speech. We'll now proceed with the rest of the Gov case by calling on the second speaker, which is called the Deputy Prime Minister. Whenever you are ready.
Hi, I'm just confirming if I can be seen and heard.
Yes.
Excellent. I'll take POIs through the chats. If you have a POI, please just drop it there. I'll drink a glass of water and then start. I drank the other glass before turning on my video, but starting in a bit. If you're a brown boy from Bangladesh like me, you probably want to study CS or engineering for two reasons. One, because my mom told me to, which is indicative of a larger social pressure for individuals from low-income communities to go to generally like things that their parents believe will net them high incomes, which likely suggests that the people who want to go to these fields are generally from like not the most like high income backgrounds. But secondly, because generally speaking, if you're someone like me, you want your H-1B sponsored in the US, which is generally the most for fields like tech, which are growing. But even beyond that, you want to live a good life, earning a high salary. You want to achieve the ultimate goal of becoming a Bay Area tech bro, which is why, generally speaking, the problem then becomes threefold. First, because so many people want to get into these programs are incredibly competitive because there are a limited number of seats because the funding is limited. Think of how competitive getting a CS degree from Berkeley or MIT is in America, or even in Asia. Think of how competitive it is to get into IIT Bombay, for example, because a tech degree is so heavily coveted and so many people want it. Second, it is incredibly expensive for the simple reason that if you're in Bangladesh or India, for example, getting labs for CS degrees require technical equipments like computers. If you're pursuing an engineering degree, it often means you require very specialized equipment. Or if you're a business major, it often means your professor is someone who could have chosen to go to industry. They chose to go to academia, which means academia needs to pay them a competitive wage so they don't go to industry, all of which likely suggests a very, very hefty tuition fee. Third, it often means that these classes are huge. My intro to CS class had 2,000 kids. It often means that professors are overworked, TAs are overworked, which often means you can't give them a lot of like attention to begin with. Ted is correct in his POI in pointing out that sure, to a degree that these courses already receive a large amount of funding, but what we characterize to you that funding is nowhere near enough and there needs to be more. The primary thing I'm going to focus on is this concept of social mobility versus this idea of an intrinsic value of arts in the first place. Ted asks us in a POI, why should this be the only metric, whether there's some intrinsic value in things like arts? On weighing, I tell you to consider three things. First, Consider that the money that the government is going to be giving to these programs are from taxpayers, which means my money is going to these things, which inherently suggests that in the long run, there should be some benefits being given back to me, the taxpayer, because I'm the one who's funding your education. This also responds to their argument on agency, because it simply means that your agency is funded by my money. I am not clear why I should care about that insofar as I am not receiving any benefits from it. We posit then that there are more immediate benefits being given to you from these STEM or like more high-end demand money to the extent to which they receive more employment, therefore they have more output and more like taxpayer income to fund things like roads. But even more immediately, I think engineers and CS majors are able to make things like roads, they're able to make better services for us, which generally means our lives are better. On a comparative, an arts degree like comparative literature often means that these things are subjective. Some people find value in Shakespeare, others may not, but I think everyone generally finds value from things like roads being given, which means you have a better like condition to live in society. The second thing to consider here is vulnerability. Robiah tells you that the vast majority of people who go to these fields are often from low-income households who want to have a shot at social mobility. These are often people who systematically, after years of government neglect, have been left out of the wealth ladder. We posit that this is a way of reparation to make sure that these people can get back on the wealth ladder and climb it in the first place. The third thing is, in a lot of cases, the board of directors for these universities often have a lot of professors who pursued art degree, and they're able to lobby and push for things like the arts getting more funding, which often suggests that it's not going to be as inequitable, but it also means that STEM degrees, to a degree, don't receive as much funding in the status quo. The next question then is on saturation and competitiveness that we get from their PM, but LO. But before that, I'll take a POI.
So the issue you seem to identify is that there's just, generally speaking, very little educational funding that goes into education in general. Your policy doesn't allow you to fiat more educational funding goes in. It just fiats that you change the allocation of it. So it seems like CS will still be comparatively underfunded if there's 2,000 students rather than like the existing 200.
There are two interpretations of this. The first is, even if the change is marginal, i.e., we have 10 additional CS students, it means there's a huge benefit being given to those 10 individuals to the extent to which they can climb the income ladder and contribute a lot to society. But second, we characterize to the board of directors in these educational facilities are often individuals who study the arts themselves and are therefore able to lobby these universities to give money to the arts as opposed to STEM subjects, which often means that these STEM courses don't get as much funding as they should get in the first place. I think we're able to engage with that in two different categories. The next question that they have is, are these fields that we say are very like employable actually employable because of saturation and competitiveness? Three rebuttals here. The first is, I think industries like tech, and I'm going to make a very educated guess and say tech is going to grow, specifically because developing countries like India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh within the next 10 years or so are going to develop, which likely means that individuals within these countries are going to have access to phones and other services, which means that demand is going to skyrocket within the next 10 years. So supply must skyrocket too. Therefore, sure, there might be more saturation, but the industry also grows, which generally means more people have employment. The second is, as we pointed out in our POI, our entire model is incredibly flexible. That is, we can use indicators like year-on-year growth of different industries. So how many additional jobs were added for accountants for 2024 as opposed to 2023. We can also use indicators like how many listings do you have on LinkedIn's year-on-year to figure out employability of every single job and therefore adjust accordingly. So if in the future engineers are no longer in demand, or like certain field of engineering isn't in demand, we can adjust accordingly. And I think social norms will largely like point otherwise. If you're someone who wants to go into university, you're probably going to research these things and then pick your major because like things like funding matters. The third thing though, what is the comparative? And consider two things here. First, they sort of assert that the arts can give you a good employability, but I'm not quite sure why this is the case. Generally speaking, you only need one lecturer for a whole class. So not everyone can become a lecturer, but to become a lecturer in the first place, you often need a PhD or a master's degree, which means that it's not enough to get a bachelor's. You need to build up on that. So there's incremental expenses. But secondly, the comparative for many of these individuals is not going to school at all because you often can't afford the education there in the first place. And you don't see the return on investment given that you're not entirely sure whether you can get a job immediately out of college. So the comparative isn't that you either get like a CS major or you become an arts major. It's often you become a CS major, or because you don't get funding, you don't go to university at all. You often choose to go to blue collar work in that instance of which your income is far, far lower. The last thing that they talk about is, this stifles innovation and creativity. Three observations. First, I'm not quite sure why the arts necessarily give you the creativity that is required to become an entrepreneur. I'm not quite sure why learning Shakespeare, for example, lets you understand how algorithms could work in a very innovative way. But you know what could help? More PCs in a school in an underfunded area. I think having hands-on experience is important. Second, these schools often allow you to take electives or breadth courses that are requirements to graduate. So you're a CS major, but you can take one philosophy course, and I think that's fine because you get your fully funded scholarship. The last thing that they tell is that There's a value that you get inherently through the arts. I'm not quite sure why, again, this is the case. They sort of assert that. We think value is intrinsic to the extent to which it gives you a return on your investment. A university often is very, very expensive in America or like most of the world. So I think given that it is very expensive, people ought to consider the cost. At the end of this debate, then, we are the only side that ensures equity by allowing the most vulnerable a chance to climb the social ladder. For all those reasons, we beg you to let the motion pass.
All right. Thank you very much, DPM, for that speech. We'll now proceed with the next deputy speaker, which is called the Deputy Leader of Opposition. Whenever you are ready, go ahead.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah, you're good.
That is excellent. I would love to engage in points of information. So if you can drop them in the chat, that'd be good. And if you don't drop them in the chat, then I can't engage with you. So yeah, okay, I don't know what I'm saying. Sorry, I'm a bit delirious. It's very early in the morning, but I will prevail. Cool, let's get started. The issue with proposition is they can fiat this policy, but they cannot fiat that once you get out of university, you're going to get a job, nor can they fiat that you'll be successful in the obtaining and the continuation of that job. And that is where our harm tricks in. Because we explain why in the vast majority of instances, you oversaturate the sector to the extent in which the poor people that Robiah and Shayor wants to talk about do not get sustenance. That is when there's more faith in not going to university, and that's when all of the harms, backfire on their side. The first and most simple question I want to ask is just, how do scholarship communities work right now? And the reason why this is important is because I want to observe here that the vast majority of the proposition case is not unique to the motion. They just describe a problem that exists, which is underfunding and people not caring about CS, which is organically solved in the status quo anyways, because newsflash, scholarship communities aren't stupid. A lot of people there are quite smart. They want to be smart for their reputation, etc. But I think there are three broad observations here. The first is, in the vast majority of instances, scholarship committees and people who fund university programs obviously react to social trends to determine the relative allocation and priority of funding. And that is true not only for the reason that they want to make sure that they stay in their jobs, but also because often there is massive amounts of information available. So if, for example, a lot of individuals in the developing world, as DPM identifies, can realize that tech is on the rise, then obviously these individuals can realize that tech is on the rise as well. The delta and the burden that proposition failed to defend is the specific allocation on the basis only of employability. On our side, maybe there's a bit more funding into CS as well, but we say there's also other considerations that are important, as Valerie explains, because a lot of these other courses also matter. And recognize, this motion isn't just about scholarships. This defends, proposition is forced to defend a world in which you massively underfund the arts, you massively underfund things like philosophy, and that is where our harm triggers in. That was the nuance that DPM did not respond to. But second of all, in the vast majority of instances, obviously a lot of people who are donating to scholarship are effective altruists or people who care about key performance indicators. That is why they can still prioritize things, for example, like computer science as well, because they recognize that there is a degree of return there that allows them to further fund the programs in the future. But finally, people obviously have electoral incentives to adjust to things like demand. So if a lot of people on the ground wants funding into CS, they can do it not on the basis of employability, but on the basis of it being quite popular. This is important, first of all, because it explains why you do not need the proposition policy to get sufficient funding into computer science, which means proposition has not yet defended the burden they're supposed to. It is a bit late in GovWhip to do so. At most, they say, no. But the issue is, you have a lot of theoretical scientists who are really big shots, and they become best friends of universities, and that's why funding is forced to go there. The first is, well, there's also a lot of hotshot CS majors like Steve Jobs. I guess he didn't go to uni, but a lot of really famous innovators and stuff also do CS and other types of things. So I'm not sure why that is unique, but that's not how fucking policy works, right? I don't call up the Taiwanese government and ask them to give my home more money. Obviously, it is independent of individual sentiments. It's because of things like electoral incentives. That is why that mechanism does not explain why the allocation of funding is done in an undemocratic way. But secondarily, this is important because this moves on to my second question, which is, how then does the policy uniquely affect underfunded kids and their ability to access subsistence? And I want to first deal with the DPM push, because DPM is correct. They identified that what ends up happening right now is that when you go to an intro to CS class, there's 2,000 kids and the professor is really tired. So yes, maybe in the best case, they get more money, but they don't engage with the trade-off, which is they also get more students, because it is not just the students that now already have an organic incentive, no thank you, to go into CS because of the social trends that Prop talks about, but now every other kid that also gets more scholarship that goes in. So on their side, professors are far more tired, you get far less contact hours, etc. And that is why the harm exists on the first level, because Valerie explains why this means that teaching writ large gets worse. For the reason that because now universities only get funding on the basis of employability, you deprioritize things like teaching principles of CS to focus more on how to write good CVs, how to do good interviews, etc. And this then becomes a harm because it means that when you are in the workplace, even if you do get ahead, you do not have the skill to be good in the workplace, so you're more likely going to get fired. But secondarily, independent of this, we explain why the oversaturation necessarily happens. I want to put out why this in and of itself wins this debate. Because if it is the case that the job market oversaturates, then I would posit that a lot of individuals do not have the ability to get a job in the first place. The only thing proposition says is to say, well, the tech industry is growing. I'm sorry, this is not analysis. There are a variety of different reasons as to why the extent of the growth in the tech sector cannot keep up with the number of graduates that end up existing. The first and most simple reason is because it's already not keeping up in the status quo. A lot of individuals who graduate as CS degrees or graduate from computer science don't have the ability to find a job because there is an upper limit to how many like computer coders you need in a specific company. But this also becomes more compounded into the future because it is quite expensive to create a new job in an oversaturated market. Because it becomes far more expensive. The trajectory of growth, even if it is on the up, as DPM explains, cannot keep up to the number of graduates that are constantly being churned out. What then is the harm here? The first is a lot of individuals end up graduating from CS being unable to find a job. And this mattered because of the nuance we explained, which is the transferability of CS and these particular sectors that proposition wants to defend is quite low. So you can't go into any other sector. Now you have massive student debt or massive sunk cost that is wasted. This is not only a massive individual harm, because if Prop is correct that these are very poor people, what the fuck are they going to do? And if that is the case, that sends far worse signaling that deters other people in their community from applying to university. So if that was the metric proposition wanted to win the debate on, they're already far behind. But the second and more nuanced way of explaining why this is harmful is because, yes, we agree, a lot of rich white people get ahead now, but when there is an oversaturation in the sector, that then becomes more pronounced because now the way in which you get mobility in the workplace is based on things like patronage, what your last name looks like, whether or not you went to the same frat as the white person that are like the owner of the company. That is when poor kids are far more likely to lose out on their side of the house. So by their own metric, they're behind in this debate. I'm going to take a POI now.
Yeah, if you have significantly more students in your class because you have a lot of money to fund scholarships, you also have money to hire more professors and more teaching assistants, right? So like the harm kind of doesn't make sense.
No, because we explain in the status quo. You explain in the status quo why there's already too little professors to too many students. So when you get more money and more students, even if you have more professors, the ratio still skews against professors. So you just make the problem worse because it's the same dynamic, but with more students, so more students get let down into the future. Finally, then, let us explain the nuances of liberal arts that Valerie explains that was not responded to. The first thing is, this policy is not just about scholarship, it's also about funding courses. So on proposition, they have to defend arts and philosophy and all of these things going away. Our claim was not that these are really important careers, but like as a political science major or a CS major, if you take courses in arts or psychology or like philosophy, you get nuances and perspectives that help you excel in the workplace, but you don't have the option to take those courses anymore. And that is why there's a decrease on agency. This is all harmful, not only harmful on the principal level, but also if you want to care about employment, that is a harm. But beyond this, we explain why teaching is far worse. And this is logically prior to anything they say. Because even if the net outcome on their side is better, if the professors are just dog shit and can't write you a good letter of rec, or don't give a shit about teaching because they care more about employability because of the policy, then schooling does not become good and kids get left behind. That is why opposition wins this debate.
Okay, all right. Thank you very much, DLO, for that speech. We'll now proceed to the whip speakers of this debate by first calling on the Gov Whip. Whenever you are ready, you can start.
Can I get like a minute? I just need to go pee really fast.
Okay. That's fine.
Hi. Hopefully it can be heard and seen.
Yes.
Great. Right. POIs via chat is fine. Wait, give me a second. Okay. Right. All right. POIs via chat, pronouns he, him, starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. I'll start off with responses before I move forward to like the whole debate winning idea about social mobility. Let's start with saturation because that's the biggest push we get from that DLO speech, right? I just want to say that like I generally don't believe like the economy is that stupid because I mean, firstly, there's a lot of projection that happens according like to jobs and employment markets, right? You have industries, you have governments, you have academics who make sure that there are certain projections about certain industries and how much jobs will be like generated within the next 8 years if certain fields are being over competitive, if there's too much saturation that happens in a lot of these areas. The fact that the government would want to subsidize specific parts of like specific courses in universities means that they will obviously care about the saturation and the actual employability, which means that they have an incentive to make sure that these projections are accurate and also make sure that the money is also flexible in whichever course they send. So if they project that, okay, CS, we've been funding CS for like 15 years, and now we feel like CS is a dying industry because there's too many people and too little jobs. We're going to shift these fundings to another degree like civil engineering within the next 3 years to make sure that these people in our country are able to get that job that helps our economy and helps them overall. Secondly, these jobs are highly employable for a reason. I reject the premise that these jobs will just run out, right? Jobs like CS or like business are not applicable in one industry, like, I don't know, a philosophy major, because these are things that you can do in other places. Like you can have a business degree yet still work in Mount Elizabeth simply because you could be a business administration in a hospital, right? Which means that in a lot of these essences, these are highly dispersed allocation of resources. And the fact that you're able to like have this course means that you'll probably like get larger opportunities and scope of that. That is essentially what Robiah tells you in the first minute of his speech when he frames out how we make sure employability is high to make sure that this model is flexible and also accurate. Thirdly, there's a lot of untapped markets, especially in developing nations. Shayor's analysis is again unchecked, right? We have countries like India, which is already doing good so good in tech, yet there's so much more potential that they could actually like unlock. Countries like Bangladesh as well, right? You have big universities like BUET or IBA that have less funding from the government, simply because the government is like, all right, you know what, there's organic growth and we can depend on it. But the point in time in which more money is given there is the point in time in which you have greater development in a lot of these nations, and you have foreign MNCs that could also be here. There's no stop at employment because a lot of these markets are untapped, and you would always have these jobs that are being created. Then they talk about like because of the oversaturation, the universities get worse off. They say, oh, you have 2,000 kids and just like 2 professors managing it. I'm assuming that you make academia more lucrative, the point in time in which you fund courses specifically, right? Which means you're often like able to bring better professors to your university. You're able to incentivize more kids to become professors to make sure that they stick to certain degrees and make sure that they have somewhat of a good academic over there. They talk about rec letters and everything. I genuinely believe universities have an incentive to make sure there are specific sections of kids who can do what they want. So none of this will be that bad, right? Okay, lastly, they talk about nepotism. I feel like nepotism is harder in skill-based subjects in general because we can like generally assume that CS and tech and a lot of these STEM majors over here are probably where money will go more. I feel like it's easier to identify prodigy talents, and there's a incentive for you to take those talents because they're able to bring you most productive output in the least amount of hours, right? Rather, in contrast to that, in art majors, where you have rich, greedy prep school kids who get a literature degree just because they want to go to Cornell and went to some like random ass school, like what's a random ass school? Eton, right? So all of that. Okay. Secondly, restriction of choices. They say that, oh, you have like a lot of like you have less choice and you have less agency when it comes to the subjects that you want to study. I disagree, but before I disagree, I'll just like weigh this off against what we tell you. We tell you that in a lot of these cases, vulnerable communities often get no choice because families don't see the point of education because they're like, okay, you know what, you could just work in our farm or you could work in the small blue collar industry we have and make sure that you earn enough to like survive economically. But the point in time in which the government is able to give you money, especially especially in these developing nations, you have a signaling meg that this is a lucrative industry for you to work in. You have the ability to get that education and the ability to convince people who prevent you from getting that education that this is worthwhile. That is an a priori benefit to all of that choice and agency they talk about. But then obviously, I still feel like unis will want to function and also operate in a place where art becomes important. I have multiple reasons for this. Firstly, a lot of these times, governments, like I think in the status quo, there's less subsidies from states or governments simply because they feel like a lot of this money goes to art majors, right? Or like art courses, which is why they're like, you know what, we don't want to give you much money because you're probably going to give it to philosophy. And like, what the hell are we doing with philosophy anyways? I know they're defending it, but they agree with me. So I think at that point, the reason why you want that money right now and the government would want to subsidize and we have a larger boatload of money that is in our bank is simply because of the fact that employability becomes a factor. Secondly, scholarship communities, scholarship committees, they say are not stupid, but they also come from a lot of these art majors. They're usually like people who've like worked, like studied in economics or like philosophy. And at that point, like I feel like they'd have an incentive to make sure a lot of money goes over there as well. Thirdly, a lot of unis care about the liberal arts programs because it's a unique selling point of their university, right? There's a lot of universities like Amherst or like Williams that like are strengthened by the core of the liberal arts program that they have, which means that these universities will always care about these subjects and you'll never have a restriction. If you do want to opt into those subjects, you're able to go there. Lastly, if you have Pulitzer-winning authors in Harvard, sure, CS might be a popular major, but they'll still have enough clout to make sure there is enough money to make this course running and get people over there. Before I move forward, I'll take that POI.
So the issue at best with your mechanism on adjusting over time is maybe it helps future graduates not get fucked by the job market, but current students who are currently studying that is about to graduate still suffer from the harms we talk about. That is why there's incredible harm that leads to less buy-in into university from poor communities.
Yeah, 15 seconds. But no, that's not the thing. I talked about projection, right? I said that it's like governments aren't stupid. They'll be able to see like what happens 5 years later. So they'll be able to adjust their model and it's flexible in that way. So to make sure that like people aren't fucked over by whatever like problem you have with saturation. Right. The problem with choices is that I also want to argue that the difference in both sides is that people who are incentivized by the arts will still be incentivized by the arts on our side. Because the people who aren't incentivized by the arts are people who care about employment, are people who care about their social mobility, which often means that like Shayor has an econ and CS degree or econ and math, whatever it is, but it is in philosophy, right? Because his mom won't let him. But Shayor's friend studies Slavic studies, but that's because he can afford to, and that's because he wants to. And I don't understand why that trade-off would like necessarily occur, because he's able to take that risk. A lot of people on our side aren't able to take that risk. Lastly, then, why do we just win this debate, even if you like let all of this go? Simply because they're unable to respond to our social mobility claims. We tell you that instant employment is extremely important because it's beneficiary to the development of a nation. You can pay off your student debts and you have the ability to climb up hierarchies. But more importantly, we tell you that a lot of these times these things are less expensive because certain courses will require grad requirements and you will just avoid that. So all of these reasons mean that you're able to just climb out of that and just like have a better life. Really proud to.
All right. Fantastic. Thank you very much, GovWhip, for that speech. We're going to move to the last whip speaker by going on to the opposition whip. Whenever you are ready, go ahead.
Hi, can everyone see and hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Verbal try. Okay. Starting in 3, 2, 1. Our path to victory is very simple. We don't need to prove that more people get access to things like, even if we don't prove that people don't get access to things like education, education quality fails. So long as we prove to you the end outcomes of whether or not they get a job, as Proposition wants to tell you about, are probably not going to manifest. We'll already take this debate. But I'm going to still prove why we win on all of those grounds. First, 3 things. Firstly, on social mobility. Secondly, on the quality of university. And thirdly, on choice. Firstly, on the idea of social mobility. I want to first prove why individuals already likely have opportunities to
like substantial amounts of opportunities to go into education on both of the house in the very first place. The first reason is what we told you throughout the entire bench, which is that government already massively funds education in the very first place, even if you're a very poor country, because they want to solve things like poverty. They want to solve things like the rural-urban divide, or like they want to get elected, for example, and they probably still want to fund education to some extent in order to get like votes from the minority who proposition says is really barred from education. So the delta, therefore, is where the money goes and which courses the money goes to, not whether not the money exists. So this takes out the impact of like parents telling you to like work on a farm or whatever, because presumably individuals opt into education massively on both of the house. But secondly, even if we take like funding, even if government doesn't like fund education at all, the problem is that people already take into the extra amount of funding that proposition wants to posit, because people already fund like the like areas in which they think are more likely to like be good, for example. So if CS is really growing as government whip wants to talk about, then probably donors already massively fund CS because they want to fund like the scholarships of individuals who are going to succeed in the future. If you're a successful CS major as an alumni, you're probably also going to donate back. And we probably posit that CS majors can obviously donate quite a lot of money on arts of the house as well, because it was true that proposition's characterization that CS is in high demand and everyone wants to go into CS, presumably their salaries are also quite high, and you get really rich donors like Steve Jobs. So it's not just art like majors donating back to the university as government with weirdly posits. Okay, so the conclusion of all this is that people should probably still get access to education. But even if we posit that only on their house do people get access to things like CS education, the reason as to why this is not winning is because of a couple of folds. The first is that their impact is significantly marginal. If you listen to all of their impacts, it's like, people get jobs, or like you help individuals pay off student debt. The problem is that if CS is already really popular and that people in these like, or like have high employability in the very first place, they're only helping individuals who would have succeeded on their house either way. They would have already paid off their student debts on arts of the house as well. The delta is therefore whether you defund the people who have the least ability to access things like who have the most student debt, for example, the least access to things like jobs. So it is the physicist theorists that you now force into a huge amounts of poverty, because now they're forced into a bunch of student debt because you're defunding them. But secondly, the problem with this impact is that it's always retrospective and it's therefore really unhelpful because it does not help the current students, right? If you're always looking at past trends to decide which students you want to fund, so long as the past trend is not accurate, then these individuals who are going into CS now are probably not going to be helped on their house. But lastly, I want to prove why even if they get huge amounts of education for CS individuals, they do not succeed in the long term. And the reason why we told you about things like oversaturation. And the reason as to why this is winning was because of a couple of folds. The first is that we really don't care about government's whip's list of reasons as to why CS is growing. Because if that is all true, then it probably means there's an inherent demand to fund CS in the very first place. Proposition needs to defend why you necessarily need to use employment as an extra metric that skews the demand and therefore has huge, like overly huge amounts of CS majors, for example. The reason as to why oversaturation was winning was because of two reasons. The first is that you harm so many people in the interim. Like even if CS is a growing industry, it's not going to be growing forever. There's a cap to in which it can be growing. We cannot have like 50% of individuals just running around being CS majors, right? So you force the poorest minorities who you coerce into joining a CS major in the very first place to get trapped into debt, to not have jobs, and to not be able to feed their family. So this knives all of their impacts, because instead of you in the worst case being a farmer, for example, you not even don't have access to that farmer job you would have initially had on Arts House. But secondly, this is a huge long-term harm on individuals because of specialization, right? If you learn CS, for example, you cannot opt into other industries because now you have learned that for your entire life and you cause a long-term harm on these individuals. That's why I was winning. Secondly, then on university equality, I want to first prove that you probably have money to fund on both sides of the house. I already kind of prove this, but it's just that if CS is already the gist is if CS is already glorified, you probably have a lot of money going into these like these education courses in the very first place. But even if we take their best case scenario, in which we get significantly less amounts of funding, the reason as to why we get better education is because of two reasons. The first is that proposition cannot guarantee that the university uses money well. So they can posit that they have more money, but they cannot posit that they use it well. Because we would posit that, as Ted already told you, Valerie already told you, they're probably going to funnel it into things like increasing CV classes, into buying connections into firms that and to get more funding because they want to boost their employability and they want to get more funding from the government. So this kills proposition's impacts on how you get better classes or better professors because the university is not going to use that money in that manner. But secondly, sure, even if they get money, the problem is they get so much more students that their impact is quite leveled because the ratio of student to professor is still the same. Go.
When the government defunds art programs, very wealthy artists or people who are wealthy and studied art majors have a strong impetus to donate way more money into the program through private means. So the arts don't really get that defunded.
Okay, you assert that people who go into art are rich, right? I counter assert that a lot of individuals who go into art are not that rich, which brings me to my third clash on choice. So we posited that you likely have a decrease in courses and things such as like philosophy, art, etc. Proposition didn't contest this beyond their POI, saying that art students are very rich. But like I just posit that that's really unlikely. Like it's widely known that most artists are quite poor. Even very famous artists like Vincent van Gogh, for example, were literally a starving artist. So that's why things like the starving artist narrative exists, right? So the implication of this is that they have to defend significant defunding of certain courses. Sure, even if we get massive funding of art, we get massive defunding of things like philosophy and theorists, in which individuals are generally not very rich. The reason as to why this is winning is because of two reasons. This, firstly, it harms the choice of the most vulnerable. A poor artist, for example, now does not have the choice to opt into art because now you massively defund their ability to do so. But secondly, this leads to significantly less development because if it is true that you do not fund things like speculative courses in developing nations, you're also not going to fund things like neuroscience or things like, I don't know, physics in like developing nations. And that just means you get less development in developing nations as well. So that's a practical impact of this principle violation. Because of all these reasons, proud to oppose.
Okay, all right. Thank you very much, Oppo, for that speech. We're gonna move on to the reply speeches now, starting first with the opposition reply. Whenever you are ready.
Hello, hello. You hear me?
Yeah.
Perfect. This affirmative team analyzes very, very well, almost to the T, why there is a current problem in sectors like tech. And the answer they gave was that because of a lack of funding, because of the fact that a lot of people like Shayor's parents want people to go into CS, there's a massive oversaturation in the status quo. The solution they give to solving this problem was to give it more money, which, in a vacuum is quite persuasive, but does not matter and is unable to solve the problem for the 4 structural challenges that we pushed down the bench, which they had very little responses to. The first of which was to say that they do not solve the problem, but rather they upskill it, which was a harm that was active in the debate, because if there was already a problem in the status quo, which is a lot of individuals don't get good attention, a lot of people don't get good jobs after they graduate because the sector is so damn underfunded and so oversaturated. You just made that problem far worse on their side. And the analysis we gave was not responded to, which was, if it is true that in the status quo, as DPM concedes to, parents from low-income backgrounds already push their kids to go into STEM, that happens, but to a far higher degree now, because that is the only place in which you can get scholarship, the only place with good funding. And the issue is, given that this policy forces a proportion and a proportional rise, you just upscale the proportion of the problem that they themselves concede already exists, which means you get the exact same problem but at a far higher rate, which means more kids that otherwise would not have gone into the system and been fucked by it now do get fucked. And that was an active harm that we independently won the debate of. But second of all, we explained why even if that was not the case, the issue is on their own metric of social mobility, they're likely going to fall behind. Because we explained why when there's more individuals that go into this particular sector, it becomes far more competitive, and therefore it is far harder for kids from low socioeconomic statuses, as Proposition talks about as an important stakeholder, to win in the debate. And there are 3 things we explained down the bench to no response on their side. The first is, let's assume the best case. Everyone miraculously, the 20,000 kids that now suddenly go into this sector that the sector didn't anticipate for, because this is a new policy that you erect like in the middle of the day. Let's assume they all get a job. Even if they did, what simply happens is they just get paid less because comparatively, if there's more jobs that exist, then the relative demand in that sector goes down. So I do not think they actually get to live the good life that Proposition claimed. But we explained 2 other things that are more important. The first was they're less likely going to get a job in the first instance. And this mattered because our harm here was not contingent on everyone failing to get a job. It was contingent on some individuals failing to get a job. Because when they did, that was when they took on student debt that they otherwise would not have taken on because they went into another less competitive sector. When they failed, that was when their entire community stopped sending kids to college because it's pursued as a dead end and pursued as a a lively suicide. That was an active harm in this debate, because if they really cared about social mobility, yes, we concede. CS makes a shit ton of money if you're successful, but you don't have to go to CS. You can be other jobs in the world that are a bit less well-paying, but still sustainable, but you decrease the incentive and the impetus to go into that because of the oversaturation and the perception of competition that did exist. But finally, we explained if you really cared about mobility, the issue of having a bunch of individuals in that sector is that it makes it far more likely that specific things like patronages, privileges, connections shine out. That is when the Eton graduate that GovWhip talks about are more likely to get ahead, because amidst a sea of 50,000 applicants, I'm more likely as a rich and privileged person to use my connections, whereas that doesn't happen in the status quo. This therefore explains the comparative harm on their side, which is on our side. Maybe these people don't become CS majors, but they are less likely going to drop out. They're less likely going to be harmed. They get a more stable and well-paying job, and that is good. But second of all, this is also an important analysis that feeds their claims, because they cannot just say we're going to adjust over time, because we explained there is an interim harm, because the governments are not sidekicks. They cannot read the future. So obviously they can make mitigating circumstances, but there's still a credible amount of individual that is likely going to lose out. And you can never adjust because you adjust into the future, but the harm has already existed. That was why there's an active harm. They cannot win the debate, because if they allow for a couple of kids to get social mobility, the cost is failing massive amounts of individuals. The final way in which we win this debate is just on courses in general. First of all, we explained why other things are important in employability, but you uniquely get rid of that because prop avoids the burden, which is, this is not just about scholarships. This is about courses as the motion states. So now you don't have any courses in the humanities, and that was bad. And even if that was not true, we explained why the university of experience becomes worse, and that mattered because often the prerequisite to getting a good job is having a good university experience. For all those reasons, up.
All right. Thank you very much, Op Reply. To conclude this debate, we call on the Gov Reply whenever you are ready.
Hi, am I visible and audible?
Yes.
Perfect. I think this is one of those rare instances in debating where our worst case is somehow better than their best case. What is our worst case? The liberal arts completely dies. All the money goes to the legions of tech bros, but saturation still occurs as a result of this. However, I think we're able to analyze why even if the industry becomes like saturated, it still expands to the degree that is necessary to get people jobs at which they don't engage with. What is the implication of this? Maybe in our worst case, as a result of saturation, an incoming CS graduate is unable to get a $150,000 job from Silicon Valley, but they're still able to get a job to the extent to which the industry grows, which likely means you might have to move to places like Tampa or New Delhi, places where we analyze the industry is likely to grow and you earn less, but instead of earning $150,000, you earn $70,000, which is still significantly higher than like the national average or what the comparative would be, which leads me to, what is the comparative? As a result of this, I think if a lot of people couldn't pursue fully funded CS degrees, they wouldn't go to university at all because they don't see the return on investment for like what they're investing for the next 4 years or so, which often means that even if you're in a highly saturated industry like CS, it is still better than being a farmer. Letitia sort of asserts from WIP that being a farmer is still a stable job. Like, vibe check this. Obviously, having like some white collar job is still better even if you're being paid less. What is their best case scenario though? It is twofold. First, it often means people do these liberal arts degrees and they pursue their passion, but they don't answer the question of where is the demand for all of these degrees. Maybe some people become lecturers, but evidently everyone can become lecturers. And even if you do become a lecturer, you require things like a PhD or a doctorate degree, which often means there are additional costs being associated to it. At the same time, people who tend to go towards more expensive and competitive STEM degrees are often rich kids who go to preppy Bay Area schools. So the social inequality further widens in the status quo. I think we're able to prove to you why individuals who really want to climb the social ladder are able to do so. Even if they don't become super successful, they become successful than they would not have otherwise done. But I don't think our worst case is going to happen in the first place. The first thing I want to talk about is funding. And we gave you 3 different layers of analysis. The first thing that they talk about is that, you have a lot of rich people like Steve Jobs donating to things like CS. The immediate intuitive problem is that if you're in a developing country like India or Bangladesh, these rich alumni often don't exist because you're in a poor country. We brought this up from the very beginning, this frame about developing countries. But moreover, we tell you that, as alluded to you in the POI, If you're someone like J.K. Rowling and you see that the arts is slowly dying, you feel an impetus to donate to the industry because you don't want your like major to sort of die. So $1 million donated to arts now means far more than Steve Jobs donating another $10 million. Also, the guy is dead. I don't know how he's going to donate a lot of money. The second thing that we analyze is exactly how this funding is going to work. We analyze government incentives to donate more into STEM. So when they see that more money is going to STEM, the pie itself is going to get larger because they don't want to waste money on philosophy majors. The second thing that we analyze is how scholarship boards work and why incentives are aligned in such a way that the arts would organically get money. We have a unique way of superventing that. Third, worst case scenario, what is the margins? The pie doesn't become bigger and more money is allocated to CS as opposed to like philosophy or whatever, which means that at the very least, we can fee out an additional like some CS majors, which means for them, all of our benefits accrue. And because of that, it also stabs their ways as well, because it means that saturation doesn't happen to their extent. So these are individuals whose lives get tangibly better off under our side of the aisle. We can do that. The next thing they say is that, teaching is bad. Three things here. First, they say that, schools are now going to focus on CV making and resume. Oh no, this is bad. Why exactly? Like, presumably, this is going to help you get your first job, which is evidently good to the extent to which a lot of the training on the job happens on the job, like i.e. on the job training. So insofar as we can guarantee your first job, you're likely to be fine from there. The next thing that they say is that, there's going to be nepotism. But as Aadit points out, often for these technical roles, you need to be able to do things like lead code or ability to like do a lot of technical challenges. So we have some degree of meritocracy by virtue of being able to test you. The last thing that they say is saturation. We break this down by analyzing industry trends and figuring out which industries are going to grow and which are going to die and how our model is receptive to that. Second, we tell you that people are adaptive to this, i.e. if you're a college grad who is considering majors, you are going to look into these trends because you would like to have a job in the future. And third, worst case scenario, the industry is saturated, but you would earn more than had you not gone to college at all, which we tell you is a comparative. They don't tell you otherwise. For all those reasons, we beg you to let the motion pass.
All right. Thank you very much, Gov Reply, for that speech. And thanks everyone for the debate. Congratulations on finishing the prelim rounds for this tournament. I'll be back with the OA in 8 minutes. Thanks, guys. Goodbye. Again, perfectly fine. All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the round. My name is Luigi. I was the chair. I'll start my OA in a moment. Game. So the call for this round was as follows. I give it a clear win for opposition. I'm going to proceed to explain this in 2 issues. But before that, just to clarify, it was a highly above average, excellent debate. I thought there were a lot of points that were raised very well. I want to focus on 2 specific contentions for the purposes of this OA. The first question is going to be on education, and it'll be phrased as to the extent in which there are some symmetric incentives for funding on both sides. How does the additional government intervention and additional subsidy, how does it change the incentives of university administrators in a positive or negative way? And then the second issue is on employment, which is to the extent that there are reasons and pressures for individuals from low socioeconomic groups to already be pressured to go into these courses for the nature of employment. Does this additional subsidy from the government create that safety network that allows them to enjoy the benefits of employment long term? So the first issue is on education. So I do think this is quite an important issue to the extent in which a lot of the arguments on high quality employment or guaranteed sustainable employment are relatively contingent on the process in which the preparation for employment, which is education, is going to be a sustainable and good venture that is going to be protected in a university setting. Because the claim of opposition is that there is going to be overwhelming oversaturation within university setting, which could reduce educational outcomes or reduce the quality of educational outcomes, whereas government's outcome is dependent on explaining that there is going to be an adjustable mechanism or adjustable metric that makes it easier for students to be less overwhelmed, or universities to be less overwhelmed by the high costs of all of these high demand educational courses like in CS, etc., etc. So the way I resolve this issue is in a few parts. The first is, given opposition's claim of oversaturation, is, the implicit assumption behind that is that when there is more money or when there's more money allocated to a university, it is not going to be allocated in a productive way because there are going to be many students that will go in, and it doesn't go along with the fast, rapid growth of the industry, and how that can be translated into a university setting, which means like having more teachers, more infrastructure in a university to support the overwhelming number of students will be added. I actually buy opposition in the end of this issue for a few sub reasons within this, right? The first sub reason is that government's response to the adjustable metric reason does not account for overwhelming predicted demand of short-term students wanting to go into university and sending their kids to them to apply for these scholarships immediately, even if there's like a 5-year long-term trajectory and that was said from government, or that there's going to be more growth that is expected in the long term. I think it eventually devolves into analysis that there will simply be more expectations for more students to apply to many of these classes in these universities, and universities are going to be incapable to adapt. But the second reason is also related to another response government gives in response to government's response eventually to the POI is that it is the case that compared to other courses like in arts or the humanities, the students that would have otherwise not gone into college are the ones that are being targeted by this policy. And I do think that this particular response does buy into opposition's claim, which is that once these are the students that are conditioned to go into university, they are essentially going to be scammed, because those are the students that are likely to be the first to be deprioritized in the process of patronage, the process of discrimination, or the process of also being competitively to the race of the bottom against other students in their same cohort. So I think it is quite clear that there are internal inequalities that are induced by an additional subsidy by the government by virtue of their policy directly targeting those low socioeconomic individuals that would have otherwise not have taken this additional brunt of the harm of getting in the process of this education, and eventually not being able to, or not always likely getting the best prospect of a high quality job in the future. So which leads me on to the second issue, right? And I want to first flag this issue by saying that there was a contribution provided by the Gov reply, which I would have wanted to credit, but unfortunately I have to explicitly say for the OA that I cannot credit, which is the response, which is that we provide them with technical expertise and we can get them in their first job for the first time. We give them with the on-the-job training, and this is going to allow us to get them that employment in the future. In response to this, opposition's preemptive claims from the very beginning from LO, one was that universities in the preparation for employment, like getting into the employment process, will massively reduce the quality of their education in order to accommodate for competing for higher funding to inflate employment metrics within their university, which includes massively cutting off other courses, focusing on like internships and on-the-job training for many of their students in this setting, which otherwise does not necessarily improve the critical thinking or the way in which they would get the theory within their university, which is a claim I would still appreciate, to the extent that they say that having many students overwhelming a few teachers means that you are offloading a lot of otherwise difficult work that those universities would have wanted to shoulder to make them easier and more competitive in the future, which again I think does reinforce the same claim that you will defer not to an inherently meritocratic system, but one that, you know, just stifles in and brings in more graduates for the sake of reinforcing those same metrics in the future, which I think does contribute to the unreliability of the metric of employment as a means for you to always sustainably account for better sustainable outcomes in the future. In response to this, government's response is again that they can adjust the mechanism, which I already responded to and explained earlier. But additionally, what I am kind of persuaded by to an extent is the explanation that there are middle tier jobs that people can achieve, that you could get a job, and that in itself is a means for you to get more social mobility in the future. Because again, the counterfactor is that they wouldn't have gotten a job, they would have been a farmer anyways. And in response to this, again, I do defer to the explanation of opposition here, which is that if oversaturation in education is a problem, oversaturation in the workplace can also be equally, if not more so, a more overwhelming problem that increases turnover within this industry, but also makes it harder for individuals to find jobs across different areas because they always want to start from competing for the higher tier jobs first, which is an explanation Gov side did concede too. So given that there is fallout in the workplace industry as well, that they will eventually have to go through that friction, is there necessarily a safety net that is meaningful, or is the extent of that safety net meaningful enough that it is worth all of those years of training or low quality training for getting into this job to inflate a metric for others, which would have never been necessary if this additional government subsidy existed? And on that response, I do think opposition gives many reasons to explain that these are individuals that could have otherwise found a middle tier job in other courses that were already massively and preemptively taken away from university settings from the beginning. All right, that's pretty much it. Hopefully that explains the most contentious parts of the debate. If you have any questions, you can message me. If you want to ask for feedback, I will respond very late. But otherwise, that's pretty much it. Thanks, guys. Have a great day, and goodbye.